people who want to get into Marxism today, they get into like the Communist Manifesto, and then they get into State and Revolution, and then they come out with this idea that like the project of Marxist socialism is to seize state power and then to undermine civil society because civil society is capitalist.
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is Stalinism. Basically, when the Bolsheviks found themselves in a position where they were at war with society, that was an index of failure. Because you can't be at war with society and not be at war with the working class. And I have news for everybody. That never needed to happen. In other words, the peasantry of the former Tsarist Russian Empire, the peasantry of China, the peasantry of North Korea, the peasantry of Vietnam, the peasantry of Cuba, they never needed to become factory workers, ever. What needed to happen was for factory workers to overcome factory labor in the United States and Europe, such that peasants could transition into something else entirely. And so, that's where the MAGA communism is like bad, in which case the statist leftism is just greasing the wheels for statist capitalism. And I'm against that. I'm not a statist. I'm not an anarchist.
That is where I like to make the nuanced distinction between the democratic socialism and the social democracy. Is democratic socialism, when it's in any sense socialist, is when it wants to kind of empower society. Like,
yes,
if it wants to have more, worker cooperatives, it wants to have credit unions, it wants to have things in society that actually, give power to workers, as opposed to the kind of idea of social democracy that's merely like paternalistic.
Yes.
Like welfareism and all that.
Yes.
Like, where's power going?
Right.
The more important question, right?
That's right. And, overcoming the domination of society by capital does, in fact, imply and would involve a decentralization of power.
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like, you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence, without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. I am here with a guest you have probably seen before, a familiar face to some who are in the kind of niche space of socialist circles. You might have heard of Chris Cutrone, and if you haven't heard of him at all, and this is your introduction, I would probably recommend listening to some of the other episodes we did together, like Lenin's Liberalism. You'll get a sense of the worldview. But this discussion in today's episode will be sort of a follow-up from our previous episode, which was on your article, Socialist Unity. And then that we talked more about broader strategy, socialist unity, organizing workers across different political lines. And in it, you did reference your campaign for a Socialist Party. That's a big part of this.
Yes.
That article you wrote. But we didn't get to talk about the nitty-gritties of the actual organizing, which I think is very interesting and something I'm happy to see, especially among intellectuals. It's something we need to seriously discuss. Like, what do we actually do? And it's interesting. Some people in my audience who were previously on the fence about you really liked the fact that you were trying to do something, like the campaign to Socialist Party. So there's a lot of interest in that. First off, I mean, just tell us about the campaign to build a Socialist Party, what you were trying to do and what motivated it. And then after, we can talk about how people can get involved and what exactly you guys are doing and stuff.
Great. Okay, so the original idea for the campaign for a Socialist Party originated in early 2015. It was, I like to say, my New Year's resolution for 2015 that I was going to start a Socialist Party. Let's do this. And the conditions at the time were such. I expected Hillary Clinton to be anointed as the Democratic Party in the United States and to win election to the presidency, because I saw the Republicans were in disarray. I didn't anticipate what happened, which is just several months later, both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders declared their candidacies and ran in the primaries for the Republican and Democratic parties, respectively. I didn't expect that. I didn't see that coming. And in some ways, that presented a challenge. But the idea that I had was, it was about 10 years into doing Platypus. And so it's been about 10 years since I started the campaign for a Socialist Party. And when Platypus started out, it was during the War on Terror, during the anti-war movement. And the organization of the millennial left at that time was the new Students for a Democratic Society, SDS. And they were kind of derailed by Obama's election in 2008. But there was this idea of revisiting the new left and really the unfinished tasks of the new left. And the way that I understand the potential and also failure of the new left was the task of building a socialist party, where there hadn't been one at that time in the United States, but also in Europe. And so the question of the new left as opposed to an old left. So the old left parties existed in Europe, less so in the United States. And so why did you need a new left? With the millennial left, there was an idea of a new left or a next left or something, right? Something that both incorporated and transcended both the 1930s version and 1960s version of the left. And in both cases, the task had failed to be achieved, the creation of a mass socialist party that could really bid for power. Okay, so what was missing? What was missing was the kind of organizing at a practical level. So I looked at the left of my lifetime. The left came out of the new left and consolidated into organizations in the 1980s as ideological tendencies. So organizations that were built to serve ideological tendencies, and Platypus had engaged that existing left, the ideological left, at an intellectual and theoretical level. But the understanding that we had in doing the Platypus project was this would be only one half of what needed to be done, meaning it was the theory side as opposed to the practical side. And there was some expectation through the anti-war movement, through Occupy Wall Street, that the practical side would be taken up by others, maybe by some of the same people, but in a different capacity, in a different, aspect of the task. So, because I knew that Platypus couldn't do it, right? I knew that we were not recruiting or organized. Our purpose was quite different. Our purpose was not to establish a political organization. So I understood the moment to be pre-political in nature. And that, again, has a theoretical side, an intellectual side, an ideological side, and it also has a practical side. So I would characterize my campaign for a socialist party as, like Platypus, pre-political, and yet still practical in a way that Platypus was not. When I say political and pre-political, what I mean is not the politics, pseudo-politics of affinity groups, interpersonal politics, but rather serious politics, meaning people cooperating with a higher purpose, even if they have serious disagreements, don't like each other, etc. So we've remained in a pre-political moment, and that includes at a theoretical and ideological level, meaning I do think that we inherit ideologies, theories, intellectual casts of mind from the past that are now kind of pseudo-political. So I'll use an Adorno catchphrase: pseudo-activity, pseudo-politics, pseudo-activity within a pseudo-reality of capitalism. Whereas the goal would be, actual activity. Social and political action is what the old socialists used to call it. Social and political action, real activity, and therefore, a real social movement, just a protest demo pantomime of a movement, which is what we've had since the 60s, and a real political movement, real politics, in a way that capitalist politics is not real politics. I also have this understanding from Marxism that the only true politics in capitalism is the class struggle. And class struggle means the struggle for socialism. It's for the collective bargaining interests of the working class. It's a class struggle for socialism. So I knew that, a lot that needs to be done simply wasn't being done. The left as it existed was not really political. It was pre-political and in some ways post-political. So that's another way that I'd put it, is that my generation, Generation X, is certainly characterized by this, but also the task of the millennial left was to overcome a post-political moment, to turn a post-political moment into a pre-political moment. Right, so we're either coming after everything's been tried and exhausted and failed and defeated, to turn that liability, dead weight of past generations weighing on the brain like a nightmare, to quote Marx, to turn that situation into an asset, an opportunity. So to turn the post-political into a pre-political moment. The campaign is meant to take up the practical tasks of the pre-political moment that we're in. That was how I envisioned it back in 2015. We were set back by the fact that the millennial left short-circuited this and went into electoral politics, went into a form of pseudo-politics, went into a form of pseudo-activity, rather than taking up the actual task of real social and political action, real activity.
Where would you put the Sanders movement in that category?
Sanders movement is
would you view that as
pseudo-politics?
Pseudo-politics? Even
Of course,
the
absolutely
2016?
pseudo-politics. Yeah, 2016 of course, absolutely pseudo-politics. I mean, look, Bernie Sanders, like Donald Trump, is a figure of my time, not a figure of young people's time, a figure of my time. Meaning, in the 80s, I knew of these people, this real estate developer, Donald Trump, and this socialist safely ensconced up in Vermont, Bernie Sanders. And when I was a student at Hampshire College in Western Massachusetts, in the 5 College area of Western Massachusetts, we used to joke, I was a Marxist at that time. Well, you could be a socialist like Bernie Sanders. You could be the mayor of Burlington, Vermont, or you could be a senator, right? You could be a socialist like Bernie Sanders, which means that you'd essentially be a left kind of gadfly on the Democratic Party in Congress, where you'd make these speeches that no one listens to, you'd register your dissent, you'd even be less than a Ron Paul or a Rand Paul. You kind of vote against everything. You'd occasionally make some symbolic gestures. And that was just understood to be what became of socialism when it's just flatlining, when it's just gone. And Bernie Sanders running in, again, I didn't anticipate it. It was like a blast from the past. Like for me, it was Bernie Sanders, what? And similarly, Donald Trump, what are you talking about? Like what? Isn't he like someone stuck in the 80s? Both of them. And I see the millennials, I mean, the way I understand the Sanders campaign in 2016, it's after Obama. So the idea was, and this is true of both Trump and Bernie, they were going to be the president that Obama promised but failed to be. They were going to end the wars. They were going to fix the economy. They were going to represent the needed reforms that Obama failed to deliver. So it was just capitalist politics, period. And so I saw the getting on board with the Bernie campaign, which, by the way, also involved a transformation of the DSA. Meaning the DSA up to that point, Jacobin was launched before Occupy Wall Street. And insofar as Jacobin facilitated the building of the DSA before Bernie was something very different than when the DSA got a lot of members through the Bernie campaign, and then even more members in opposition to Trump. So I see that trajectory as a trajectory of giving up politics. So, I'm a dialectical thinker, meaning it's precisely when people think that they're getting serious about politics that they might be giving up on politics.
Do you view Occupy as politics?
Well, Occupy was anarchist. It's not political. It was assiduously not political, meaning it was in some ways anti-political. It was a last gasp of a kind of 90s post-political and anti-political kind of, World Social Forum, anti-WTO, Battle of Seattle type thing. And that was its liability, but it was also its kernel of truth, meaning it did represent something different other than, and in some ways complementary to, the anti-war movement. Right, so I mentioned the new SDS. The new SDS, they very self-consciously did not want to be a single-issue movement. They didn't just want to be an anti-war movement. They wanted to be a lot more than that. As it turned out, they had a hard time with that. They weren't really geared towards the Great Recession. And when Obama was elected as both a Great Recession candidate and financial crisis reform candidate, but also as the anti-war candidate, it seemed that there was no purpose anymore to the millennial left. The rhythm of the left is very much tied to capitalist politics. That's why the left is dead. I'm infamous for saying the left is dead.
Mhm.
The left is dead because it's just a fringe tale on capitalist politics. It's part of the theater of capitalist politics. It's part of the pseudo-politics of capitalist politics, except it's the theatrical version of it. It's the pantomime version of it.
Yeah.
And,
I just want to kind of, maybe for a point of clarification, because this is like obviously a very highly Marxist way of seeing politics. Like
I am the last Marxist.
Yeah, I mean, this is what I've said to you, to the people who think you're not really Marxist because you didn't support actually existing socialism,
Right.
or whatever. I mean, if anything, my disagreements with you have always been, I think you're just too Marxist.
Sure.
But
Sure.
well, because like I do view Bernie and Trump as very quintessential political moments.
Yeah.
Even if Bernie, didn't succeed, they significantly reshaped the way we talk about politics. I mean, I view them as significant like events. That
Way we talk about politics.
Sure, but even in the sense that I think both were class struggles, even if they weren't moving to socialism in Marxist sense. In this, I've even viewed Trump
Sure.
and MAGA as a class struggle in the sense
They
that it's
both
kind of
represented
against the
traits.
liberal.
They tried to
the-
expand the electorate in the direction of the working class, both of them. And I
Mhm.
think that's why both parties resisted
Sure.
them.
Right, they're
And
rabble rousers.
They're the
Yes.
rabble rousers. This is why we have like left populism and right populism.
Mm.
I don't really like those designations. But I would also say that the class character of the Bernie movement and of the Trump movement, they're both petty bourgeois. And not, just in a sociological sense, but in the kind of discontents that they represented. Meaning they represented the people who were losing out to big capital,
Sure.
right? And the working class is, by default, subsumed under petty bourgeois democracy. And this will actually get to a later point in our discussion, I think, which is how I understand the task of trying to build a movement for a socialist party in a very preliminary stage is going to be a species of petty bourgeois radicalism. It is, inevitably.
Okay. I'm interested.
Meaning that the class character of the movement would have to be brought about. It isn't just there to begin with. It's not there instantaneously. In other words, the working class movement has to be built as such. Otherwise, the working class are just petty bourgeois as opposed to haute bourgeois. They're like low on the bourgeois social spectrum as opposed to high on the bourgeois social spectrum. And so as such, the working class has a petty bourgeois interest. It has a petty bourgeois democratic interest.
Mhm.
And that's all well and good. That's, that is legitimate, but it is not itself socialist, and it doesn't even by itself point to socialism. It points to, William Jennings Bryan populism, and it points perhaps to the trajectory of that into progressivism, into progressive capitalist politics, progressive
Or
liberalism.
fascism.
Or
Or
fascism. It can, of course, do that as well. Although, it's just a peculiarity. I mean, I would say that the reason that we don't have fascism is that we don't need fascism. Meaning capitalism hardly needs fascism to, defend itself or to enforce itself. There were moments in history where fascism was necessary, and we're not living in any such
Sure.
thing. Right.
Yeah, well, I think if anything, we have the conditions for fascism, but it's a problem for capitalism, and that you see, on the one hand, this anti-migrant wave everywhere, really, just about everywhere.
Everywhere.
And that is a huge problem for capital because,
Yeah.
if you look at any economic study on like whether immigration is good for the economy, and of course they measure good for the economy in capitalistic terms, it's always good, even in the
Good.
case of even illegal immigration.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Maybe especially.
and like, they're saying, well, there's aging population, we need more migrants, and the anti-migrant wave is causing a big problem now when you have that. I mean, the conditions are there for like Nazi National Socialism. I mean, they're there. They just haven't really manifested in that way. Because what I think we've seen with far right populism is sort of like the democratic. It's kind of like what Bernie Sanders is to revolutionary socialism, if that makes sense. Like they're trying to appeal to that kind of fascistic sentiment, but they aren't fascist. Like I don't think Maloney is actually fascist. I don't think really any of the far right leaders are actually fascist. I don't think Trump's fascist, but they appeal to a yearning that, let's say, we're starting to see with the new right, overtly fascist figures in response to the kind of unpopularity
Or just a
of like
discontent.
Nick Fuentes.
Yeah, Nick Fuentes.
Or
there are these
like
funny
that.
characters.
They're getting big.
Characters. They are. I mean, maybe. I mean, but their appeal is limited. I mean, and you could say maybe Mussolini's own appeal and Hitler's own appeal was always limited too, meaning that they only got support on a different basis from their ideology. They got their support on a more conservative basis and on their kind of revolutionary bona fides, that really kept things more the same than they promised to.
Oh, in practice, sure. But in
Yeah, in
recruitment,
practice.
I mean, I don't know if this is a real quote because I tried to verify it when I was reading Eric Hoffer's The True Believer.
Uh-huh.
And in it, he mentions like how there was like this Goebbels quote of saying like it's much easier to recruit a communist than it is a social democrat to the fascist National Socialist Party. And I don't know, I couldn't actually verify that, but it speaks to like a popular conception, which is that fascism taps into the revolutionary sort of sentiment.
I mean, let me put it this way. So I don't think that we have fascism, and I think that that's in large measure because it's not necessary. It's also because society is already fascist enough. It doesn't need to be any more fascist, right? So this is the kernel of truth when leftist activists call the police or ICE fascists, right? Because, in some ways what they do is even more of a polished, repressive, effective force than the fascists were, right? And they're as fascistic as they need to be, and they even have their own in-group, out-group dynamics, their own kind of corporate interests, if you will. So there's a kernel of truth to all the hysteria of the police state and its various agencies. But still, in fact, we haven't adopted the state of emergency, fascism, and we're not likely to. So I would just say that, Bernie and Trump, left populism, right populism, petty bourgeois democracy. Let's just leave it there and not even get into the radicalism of it. My sense is that, Bernie, of course, could have been the Democratic Party nominee and he could have been elected president and it would have been fine. It wouldn't have destroyed the Democratic Party, nor would it have been a crisis of the state. No.
Probably would have been good for the United States.
Would have been good for capitalism.
In fact, that's what Third Worldists said. Third Worldists often said, if Bernie wins, actually, it's bad because then American hegemony will get stronger.
It would. Absolutely, it would. It would serve a legitimating role for U.S. imperialism, no doubt. And this is the sort of MAGA communist kernel of truth, Bernie and the DSA are like the social patriots, the social imperialists. You know, it's social chauvinism. No, I mean, look, it is. It is. Right. Like, if you want a reinvigoration of American patriotism, probably Bernie Sanders was the way to go. More than Trump. More
Yeah,
effective. Potentially. And after all, that's what Bernie offered. Except,
which I'm not against. I don't view American power or American hegemony and imperialism as necessarily connected. In that, America
oh, yeah.
had, I mean, has isolationism as a concept gets popularized in America. I mean, it's where, like,
So anti-imperialism is a funny thing, because I think the anti-imperialism that we have and that we've had historically is, again, a petty bourgeois anti-imperialism, meaning it's a discontent, popular discontent with big capital, with the state serving the interests of big capital. So if imperialism is monopoly capital and finance capital, well, there are a lot of people who it has nothing to do with socialism whatsoever, who are unhappy with the rule of finance and monopoly capital, and are unhappy with the imperial state, who are unhappy with the police state, and who are unhappy with foreign wars that seem to strengthen that imperial state and seem to strengthen finance capital and monopoly capital. So I understand all of that as a petty bourgeois, a really conservative liberal anti-capitalism. A lot of anti-imperialism is just that. Now, of course, the trick in capitalist politics is to square the circle, meaning to make monopoly capital, finance capital, imperialism, the police state acceptable to the people. And Bernie might have served to do that much better than Trump. So this is what people have never understood. They've thought that I'm the pro-imperialist Marxist or something. No, I always thought that the anti-imperialists were woefully inadequate in their anti-imperialism, because their anti-imperialism was kept within a framework that was completely compatible with the continuation of capitalist imperialism. Doesn't present any.
Usually, but like leftists today usually mean by anti-imperialism is like on the mass level, like probably most people just say like ending wars, which I would be for. But I think on the hard left, even on the hard left, like anti-imperialism is really just anti-Americanism, and multipolarity is like
it's diluted.
Goal, and
it's
diluted. I don't know, to those people, I think that sounds way worse. Like, I mean,
most people would.
Do you think like the expansion of Russian power is better? I mean, it's like
they're
who's
not even
backing the
thinking
far
about
right
that.
everywhere? It's Russia's backing the far right everywhere.
That's right. No, they're kind of, they're not sure about what they want. I mean, Bernie has up until Israel-Palestine, the most recent instantiation, he had pretty impeccable anti-imperialist bona fides. So, pro-Cuba. And it's like, being pro-Cuba against the embargo of Cuba might be the better capitalist policy for reabsorbing Cuba into the imperialist fold. You might want to do that by being a friend. That might be more effective than being an enemy. And that's what Bernie represents. His point is that this is a cruel and ineffective policy.
Sure.
It's a cruel, ineffective,
overreach is bad. Overreach of having the military bases everywhere. It's how empires they decline is overreach.
Yeah, but sticking with the Cuba case, Cuba operates in a capitalist world. Cuba can function entirely compatibly with U.S. capitalism. There's no problem there. There might be some gusanos, there might be some Cuban Americans who want to reclaim some property that they might have lost when they fled Cuba. But apart from them, there's no reason why the U.S. can't take advantage of communist Cuba the way it has with Vietnam and China. Right? There's no problem. And, again, Trump was probably completely sincere when he offered an economic relationship to Kim Jong-un. He said, we can bring prosperity to North Korea.
Which, of course, the dynasty wouldn't want, because then more wealth would mean more elites, which would rival their power.
I mean, maybe they could translate it. In other words, maybe they could retire. Maybe they'd have to go into exile, but they've squirreled away billions of dollars. It's fine. It's, who wouldn't really want it? Not Kim Jong-un who wouldn't want it. It would be some people in the kind of apparatus who would feel threatened, right? Who would feel more susceptible to being held accountable by the people if the communist state ever fell. And that's the problem with Cuba and China, for that matter. So, in Vietnam. But, these are just policy tactics. These are not.
I view them as quite different just because of
They are different.
The North Korea's dynasty, more almost like a monarchy of sorts. And then Cuba is like a big bureaucracy that so many people are stacked in, which makes it very hard for people in the regime to want to reform.
Yeah, Cuba, Vietnam, and China.
Vietnam, we're able to absorb the capitalist elites in the party and kind of have at least up until we could say maybe that will change with Xi Jinping, but it's like collective leadership, collective dictatorship. That was very adaptable.
That's true. No, that's a difference. That's true. All that I'm saying is that a lot of what the left thinks of as difference on principle is really tactical differences within capitalist politics. Meaning, like being pro or anti-imperialism, as if anyone's pro-imperialism. Imperialism's a dirty word. Nobody's pro-imperialist. Everybody's anti-imperialist. But in actual fact, everybody is actually pro-imperialist, even if they disclaim it.
The neocons.
Yeah, the neocons, well,
pro.
They have their own ideological warped thing, which is to say, it's like, I'm an old style Marxist in the sense that nobody's pro-capitalist. Capitalism is a dirty word. Right? Nobody's avowedly pro-capitalist because capitalism, what's that? No, you want free markets,
right,
private enterprise, right? Everybody's anti-capitalist, and yet, of course, everybody's pro-capitalist, in fact. And it's the same with imperialism, but it gets more complicated because there is such a thing as petty bourgeois democracy, small capital. There is the warping of society and politics by capitalism, and that is therefore a kind of, it's a form of anti-capitalism, this anti-imperialism. But anyway, coming back around to it, 2015, that was not the issue anymore. Meaning the wars had wound down, not entirely, but largely, even though there was a lot of disgruntlement on the left with Obama. Still, Obama was sticking to the George W. Bush timetable on withdrawal from Iraq, at least. And, they got into some conflicts with military leadership, Mike Flynn, in terms of the Afghanistan situation. So, but generally that issue had wound up, and also the Great Recession seemed like we were coming to the Great Recession. The only question was, what were the terms of the recovery? And that's where Bernie and Trump both represent a kind of discontent with, we're going to recover from the Great Recession, we're going to pull out of the war on terror, but in terms that seem to maintain the old status quo and therefore leave society liable to the same problems just earlier, to the recurrence of these things. So they enlisted a lot of popular discontent. I didn't see that coming. I saw a kind of a desolate landscape on the left that could be a wide open field for a new kind of organizing. So social organizing, social action, civil social organizing, civil social action, to try to rebuild a movement for socialism. And there were other impulses in that direction. So Occupy Wall Street retired into grassroots community organizing. And there was something called the Marxist Center, an organization called the Philly Socialists who tried to be the motivator behind that in the post-Occupy period. But they seem to have stalled out and also be afflicted by the usual ideological problems on the left and the internal divisions. So it seemed less clear than they should be about the actual task at hand. So not a kind of Marxism or a kind of anarchism, These seemed to get in the way of what needed to be done. And it seemed like I could help facilitate something that people already wanted to do, but were unclear about how to do it.
So the party, I want to get into the specifics. I know I want to get into the first principles. At least I'll more question some of the first principles like in the second half. But I want to get into the structure of it. But first, like for clarification, right? Because some people will be like, okay, well, why would I want to even join? I mean, so is it an explicitly Marxist party that's trying to be built, or is it a broader socialist party?
Broader Socialist Party.
Okay, so what does that mean?
Okay, so there are two levels to it, right? Socialism would have to be defined as more of an ongoing process, like in the process of building up this kind of activity. Meaning, right now, the motivation for a socialist movement is actually lacking. It's one of the reasons why people don't do it. It's why they go for fighting this or that capitalist policy. Because it does seem unmotivated. It seems only ideologically motivated, not practically motivated. Meaning, does the working class need to be struggling for socialism right now? No. Only in a very abstract and objective sense. It's not subjectively motivated, it's practically motivated. Because of that, really the necessity of a socialist movement would have to be established. And my understanding of that is that any kind of civil social organizing that we would be doing now, that we are doing, is essentially liberal in character. It's liberal, it's petty bourgeois democratic, it's petty bourgeois radical, maybe in character. And in that respect, it would not make sense to try to maintain some distinction between anarchism and Marxism, or even between like socialism and libertarianism. Like it all kind of becomes of a piece. And so the necessity of socialism, to my mind, only arises at the limits of liberalism. Meaning, I understand civil social organizing per se. I'm a Marxist in the sense. I think of like anarchism as liberalism. Labor union organizing is liberalism. Collective bargaining, liberalism. It's entirely within a liberal framework of civil liberties, civil rights, freedom to associate, freedom of speech. Right. It's
you're not using that pejoratively.
No, I'm not using it pejoratively.
Yeah, that's worth clarifying because you
That's
have
right.
a different view of liberalism than a lot of
So liberalism doesn't
Stalinist
mean
Marxists I encountered.
right.
Yeah.
Liberalism doesn't mean Democratic Party politics, because Democratic Party politics is hardly liberal. What it is progressive.
Correct. Yeah.
Right. And really the people who uphold liberalism are the Republicans, but in a very confused way.
Ideologically, and at least
Yes.
not in practice.
Not practice. No, in
Yeah.
practice, of course, both are imperialist capitalist parties, of course.
Right. Progressivism, that's a good distinction because I had this disagreement actually with Catherine Liu because she was talking about how we need an anti-liberal left, and she was trying to describe liberal as like kind of like woke and cancel culture and the sort of PMC left pseudo leftism we see. And I was thinking like I don't know if that's a good term because they're very anti-liberal in character. I mean, wouldn't progressive maybe be a better description? Because progressivism start off as kind of authoritarian.
Yes.
People forget like very much so, like
very much
Teddy Roosevelt Wilsonianism, and to an extent we're even like, I think we brought this up in another conversation once, but like some of the progressives gravitated to Mussolini before they found out what he was doing.
Of course. Well, yes, and progressivism also, tends to be more or less self-consciously Bismarckian. Fabian socialism in the UK was very self-consciously Bismarckian, and the progressives in the United States were also impressed by Wilhelmine Germany and Bismarckian kind of policies and the organization of the state, Woodrow Wilson was a great student of
Correct.
Germany.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, you wrote a thing on socialism or capitalism and came out in support for socialism of the Bismarckian kind.
That's right.
Yeah, before I wrote that, I think in 1902 or something.
That's
like
right.
way before the Russian
Uh,
Revolution.
That's right. Way before the Russian Revolution. And of course, out of opposition to Marxism, Wilson, of opposition to the SPA in Germany, right, as well as the socialists in the United States. So that's right. And so I think that, again, liberal in the sense of the working class communities, working class people claiming their civil liberties, civil rights under capitalism. That is the starting point. That's the starting point. And then I think of this as having a certain logic to it. That when one pursues that, one comes up against the limits of that within capitalism, and then that motivates the struggle for socialism. Right? That we have to get there. We can't start out ideologically socialist because that could mean all sorts of things. It could mean Bismarckian socialism. It could mean Stalinism. It could mean anarchism. It could mean a kind of liberal socialism like Matt McManus and Ben Burgess kind of thing. And,
Well,
which is,
is that not closer?
it is, but I think that it confuses some things. It doesn't necessarily confuse some things. Meaning,
Well, because I'm trying to get, like, when you say you have the party is not committed to a very like a specifically Marxist conception of socialism, then it's like, where do you draw the line? Like, you described it as a process, but still it's like, what do we mean even by that? Like, are we talking about socialism worker-centric or socialism in the state-centric sense? Because
no,
of course, the Dungists will say
class.
China is progressing to
Right.
socialism as a process. Or do we mean like in this kind of the way I'm just going to take a guess. I mean, I'm guessing you come at it from kind of like the Kautskyist sort of view, which like Kautsky was, running the Social Democratic Party, which was Marxist, but also working with people who had more of a revisionist streak, like Bernstein.
Lassallean.
Yeah,
It was a
LaSalle.
Lassallean party. It was a Lassallean party that the Marxists eventually leadership of. The way that I put it is this. So maybe coming at it a different way, because you're looking for like lines of demarcation or something. I think by right, Matt McManus, Ben Burgess, Bread and Roses, DSA, Jacobin faction, Marxist Unity Group, different faction of the DSA, the MAGA communists. They should all be part of my campaign for a socialist party.
Interesting.
They should all be. They absolutely should be. And because the task is the same, and meaning for any of them to become serious, they'd have to learn the skills, acquire the capacities of the kind of civil social organizing we are taking up as our task. So I would want all such people to participate in this. And then we'd figure out what we really agree and disagree on. Because to begin with, all the agreements and all the disagreements are spurious. It's not about anything, right? It's like thoughts in our head, which don't amount to anything. The ideological differences are not significant, because ultimately we're going to be driven by practical necessity, not principle. And this is something that we can get into, but the way I described it to the platypus kids when I launched this, I thought of doing it under a pseudonym and not telling anybody about it, doing it secretly and just doing it. And then I thought, okay, no, because I was still president of Platypus at the time. And so I wanted some people in Platypus to collaborate with me on this to begin with. Not everyone, but a couple of people. And then there were other people outside of Platypus. And so I told them, I said, in many respects, this is extremely opportunistic in the old Marxist sense of opportunism. Meaning not opportunism in the sense of crimes of opportunity, not in the colloquial sense of opportunism, but in the sense of, really it has to be about tactics. It can't be about ideas and principles. It's got to be about figuring out what works at a tactical level, at a practical level. And that means being open to all sorts of things and also collaborating with all sorts of people in society. So I do think that, I think back at the time in 2015, I had this idea that, okay, the the millennials had sort of squeezed the old dried out lemon of the new left baby boomer generation at a kind of theoretical level, at an ideological level. But what they hadn't gotten from the boomer generation, from the new left 60s generation, was their practical knowledge, their practical experience, their practical expertise. So they hadn't learned from them at the level of actually organizing and building a movement, because in fact, those people had done that. They did have some skills in that respect. And there's no point in reinventing the wheel. But I also thought at the same time that we would have to apprentice ourselves to the existing civil social organizations that exist. So we would have to work with, the dreaded NGOs, but also other kinds of community organizing formations, churches. In other words, it would look like we were just doing what everybody who does civil social organizing does. And we would have to start there, figure out how they do things, figure out the limitations of how they do things, also look at not only what are they doing, but what are they not doing. Because on the one hand, it looks like society is fully colonized by corporate capitalism, the state, and the NGO apparatus. It looks like all the space is covered. On the other hand, it's very thinly covered. There are a lot of gaps. There's a lot of openings. There's a lot of neglected aspects. It's very threadbare. It's not as thoroughly organized, actually, as the world that the 60s generation faced in the Fordist era. Because the capitalism has learned it actually is not necessary to try to integrate everything so thoroughly the way they tried to do in the mid-20th century, that they can get by on a very threadbare kind of apparatus to maintain capitalism. So we'd have to figure out how things are done now, why they're done the way they're done now, what they're doing, what they're not doing, and what opportunities actually exist for organizing lies fallow now. Right? And so we would have to apprentice ourselves to the liberals in the pejorative sense, but also to people who, we don't normally think of as liberals, like churches. Is the Catholic Church a liberal civil social NGO? Of course it is. Are the evangelicals essentially liberal NGOs? Of course they are. What else would they be? Right? So we don't think of them as liberals, but in fact, in practice, that's what they are.
By that you mean just civil society.
Yes. That's right. And they are operating in the gray zone of what is not administratively regulated or, strictly speaking, within the bounds of the law. So I saw, for instance, one of the things that we can talk about is the anti-deportation organizing that the campaign is doing now. So
your campaign, the campaign,
yes,
Socialist
my
Party.
campaign. That's right. And the Trump administration complained. They complained that the churches are helping illegal migrants and are getting in the way of state action. And that doesn't mean that they're going to repress the churches, but they were like, shit, we can't repress the churches, so we have to operate around them, even though they are doing things on the ground that make it difficult for us to implement the policy of deportation that we want to do. And so are the churches doing something illegal? Kind of, they are, but it's politically impossible for the state to come down on them. Right? So again, we have to learn how these things are done, because a lot of what goes on in capitalism is in that gray area. It's in the quasi-legal, somewhere between the official and the informal economy. And obviously immigrant communities operate very much in that realm and are by necessity having to organize themselves because they can't take advantage of official institutions in the same way. And that in fact, citizens need that, right? They have the same necessity as immigrant communities. Working class people who are US citizens have the same needs that the immigrant communities in terms of this kind of organizing that we need to do. But again, purely within liberal terms. Certainly for a socialist movement, that kind of organizing would be necessary. but also just for, there's a lot of discussion in the last several years about the dysfunction of society and the lack of civil society and the atomization of society. And, how neoliberal capitalism has destroyed society. That's all true. However, it's a kind of chicken or egg paradox, right? So do we have neoliberal capitalism because of the gutting of civil society, or do we have a gutted civil society because of neoliberalism? It's actually a chicken or egg paradox. I would say that this is one of the reasons why I put in the 11 Theses, that a socialist movement would transform society long before it ever came close to taking power. It would transform facts on the ground. It would transform things very profoundly. It would affect capitalism deeply. It would affect mainstream politics, even when it stood apart from mainstream politics, because mainstream politics would have to deal with facts on the ground that are created by the socialist movement. That's the way it was. That's the way it was back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and that's the situation we should aspire towards now. So changing facts on the ground is really the task at hand, and really the politics of the capitalist state, that will come much later. Meaning, we have to organize in such a way, because it's going to take a long time, that what we're doing is meeting a necessity that exists regardless of which party is in power, or which laws are in place, or which administrative policies are in force. Right. So that's why we have to act independently of any administrative policies or laws. We do. Right. So again, in that quasi-legal realm that actually capitalist corporations already operate in, as well as civil social organizations like churches. Obviously churches, they care about the law and administrative policies only to the extent that they need to. Otherwise, they do what's necessary. They do what they think is right. We have to be the same way. I think that there's a whole realm that young people especially, are completely unaware of. It's like invisible to them. There's a whole dimension of reality that's invisible to them because they're completely captivated by capitalist politics.
And, more than young people, I would say it's the people who tend to encounter this stuff, who get educated in professional managerial class circles, like myself, who tend to aspire, at least, especially if you're doing school to get a job, into state apparatus in one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
Or
quasi-state.
And you see politics in this very state-centric way. I mean, this does rhyme with a lot of the stuff my mentor Assad Haider was big on, which was he was big on politics outside of the state. I also see parallels with Eric Olin Wright's How to Be Anti-Capitalist in the 21st Century, when he talks about the various ways to undermine capitalism. He talks about eroding capitalism as opposed to smashing, or as opposed to escaping, or as opposed to taming.
Right.
And he talks about how capitalism, right, what we call capitalism, the forces of the relations of bourgeois society emerged far before capitalism as a system happened, right? Like they
That's
happened
a big difference with
society, and then it wasn't capitalism itself. I mean, there's debates on this, right? But I mean, I do take Ellen Wood's view that capitalism itself becomes a system when you have a state apparatus that basically provisions capitalism as an order and makes it a compulsion to adapt to. And that's where I think, you already know this already. I'm really saying this for the audience. I think this is like a part of Marx's work that you and Platypus do a very good job of illuminating, which is that capitalism in many ways is kind of like the undermining of civil society, of bourgeois society, because there's this compulsion to adapt to the market. You get a proletarianization of the petite bourgeoisie, which was the whole force of
bourgeois
the emancipatory character of bourgeois society to begin with.
That's right.
Whereas I see this whole new school now emerging from neo-Marxist, or really I would say they're all under this post-colonial revisionist school of history, but they often call themselves Marxists, they like to associate bourgeois society as capitalism,
Right.
and that's where
Right.
you get like the Lizardo view that like
Yes.
liberalism is just rationalization of private property,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because then like I think this is important because
Yeah.
if we look at like the emergence of capitalism, it does tell us to some extent that like socialism is not going to be implemented by just it's not going to be implemented.
That's right.
This idea of implementing socialism from the top down, it has to emerge in civil society, which is I guess where it brings us to one Discord commenter actually critiqued your approach as
Uh-huh.
saying it was too similar to anarchist
Yeah. Yeah. It's
praxis,
gonna sound like
right?
anarchism. It's gonna sound like
Right, yeah.
anarchism. It's gonna be in some ways anarchism. It's gonna be somewhere between Maoist long march grassroots organizing and anarchism.
And
It is
petit
gonna
bourgeois radicalism, like petit bourgeois liberalism.
That's right. Because that's the way I understand those things anyway. Right. So let me say something about my differences with Ellen Mexon Wood and Eric Olin Wright, which is that my difference is that I actually follow Marx in that overcoming capitalism is going to be a different process than the emergence of capitalism. So the emergence of capitalism was more of an organic process. And where the political form of it came after the social transformation had taken place.
Right. And then the political form is not organic in the sense that its enclosures are a policy.
Right, but that still had to be motivated by something. In other words, there still had to be a necessity to that. It, at a certain point in history, anyway, there was a possibility of it. There was a necessity of it, and maybe it's an accident or a contingent thing that only after the fact has a character of necessity to it. But in any case, I don't think that we're going to evolve socialism within capitalism. I don't. I think that what you evolve within capitalism is a socialist party. In other words, a proletarian socialist movement and a proletarian socialist party. But that's what you can build under capitalism. And that does affect capitalism. It does change it. It doesn't erode it. It transforms it. And in some ways, and this is the big difference with Bernstein, is that it exacerbates the contradictions of capitalism. Because right now, the contradictions of capitalism are vague and diffuse. And they show up in other forms. They don't show up as contradictions of capitalism. They show up as, imperialism, etc., racism, these kinds of things. It doesn't show up as capitalism. So building a proletarian socialist movement will actually bring capitalism per se into existence. Will actually make the contradiction of capitalism manifest. And then the goal will be, and this is, I'm showing my Marxist cards, and I don't know how it will go in terms of how this process will actually play out. But my hypothesis is that, again, the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat will be made manifest, meaning the Socialist Party will be faced with a choice, take power or not take power. And taking power will mean not only the political power, but the social preponderance of the working class already organized in civil society, such that you could have a proletarian dictatorship and that could lead to socialism. Because I do understand the dictatorship of the proletariat as taking over capitalism. It takes over capitalism.
So you do believe in the dictatorship of the proletariat?
I do. I absolutely do.
Okay.
And meaning
but then you said that a campaignist Socialist Party will be basically petit bourgeois politics. That's where I was like, okay, there's a realism to this, because that's the thing.
Yes.
I'm for kind of. I think the proletarian agent thing is just no one really believes that. I mean, in the sense that all the Marxist parties, right, are
it's implausible.
Are PMC or petit bourgeois, and then recruit.
But they weren't. They weren't.
But they were usually led by classes that were other than the proletariat.
I mean, look, I do think that I agree with Leo Panich that the 50 years of 1870 to 1920 were the first and only time that the subaltern have ever organized themselves into a social and political force of their own. I do believe that. And that is the period of high Marxism.
Right.
That is the period of proletarian socialism. Now,
Right.
the failure of that, then ex post facto, it looks like it was just a new petty bourgeois elite riding on the backs of the working class. But in fact, it was not that. In fact, it was.
Yeah. It wasn't because also like journalists and a lot of the intellectuals who were part of the socialist movement there didn't exist like the apparatuses for these people to have like professional careers in the way that they did after the managerial revolution, right? So it's
Yeah, it
like
was
a kind of
different. They were
yeah.
supported by the socialist movement. They were, but in an organic way. In other words, this is where you get the Gramscian organic versus state intellectual distinction. Right. So the only examples of organic intellectuals are from the bourgeois era of the rise of bourgeois society, kind of pre-capitalism, and then the socialist movement. Like those are the only authentic examples of organic intellectuals. And in both cases, there was a transformation of the organic intellectual into a state intellectual. Right? It happened in the 19th century, and then it happened again in the 20th century. And so I take this digression only because I know that to begin with, I'm dealing with the socialist intelligentsia. I know that. The question is, what are they going to be disciplined by? Are they going to be disciplined by cranky theories and weird philosophies? Or are they going to be disciplined by the realities of actual working class movement? Are they going to be disciplined by reality? Are they going to be disciplined by civil social reality, facts on the ground reality? Or are they just going to be applying their theories to reality and thinking, oh, well, which is the progressive versus which is the reactionary side of the working class? Or which side is
Right.
capital? You know, parasitic capital or is it productive capital? It's like none of this has any operant reality to it. You know, these are not a prioris. And so there's a role for intellectuals to play as like basically facilitators or helpers for the working class in its struggle, meaning they can do journalism, they can be lawyers, they can be doctors, they can be people who serve the movement and who clearly would be serving the movement. Meaning, to begin with, journalists, lawyers, doctors, they're not going to be political leaders. No. Like these are not the people that you think of when you think of like which kind of professionals are good political leaders.
Well,
I mean,
they usually tend to be lawyers.
they usually tend to be lawyers. I mean, I guess
Politics across the board, I would say.
Rand Paul is
even
a doctor.
socialist, even socialist politics.
Even socialist
Lenin,
politics.
Lenin, Castro, lawyers.
He was a lawyer, and he also described himself as a journalist. But I think that again, someone like Lenin, without the working class's own action, first of all, the revolution can't happen, and second of all, it can't become socialism.
Sure. And surely if his brother didn't get executed by the czars, I'm sure.
He might have been a state intellectual.
Yeah, maybe.
He might have been a state intellectual. He might have been a liberal who sought like reforms of Tsarism. You know, he might have been.
My sort of point in bringing that up is just that I want you to clarify, like when you say like proletarian, you're like well aware that the party will have like it will involve multiple classes.
Yes, of course.
And that the socialism will involve a class alliance that isn't just like proletarian, because a lot of people dismiss that rightfully because it is just like obviously bull in that.
Right.
Of course, there's multiple classes involved and there's multiple motives involved beyond class interests. Like, why do a lot of people, get involved in socialism? It's not literally because it's in their economic interest. It's
more of an ideological motivation.
Yeah, it's a purpose. It's a project. It's a thing to do, and that's, I think, a very human thing.
Yes.
Right.
And it's even a bid for power. And the question is, how do we discipline to best effect? Meaning, if it's just about interpersonal power, that's pretty lame. And also, there are probably more satisfying ways of doing it. But, and also as like a professional career, it's not going to be the best way to go.
Today, it's pretty lucrative.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we have
not a socialist, but to be a leftist.
to be a leftist, maybe to be a
Or-
socialist. We've got Zoran Mamdani. I mean, it seems like it might be a career path for some people. Again, this is something where proletarian socialists.
certainly a social currency, I would say, actually.
There
like
is.
like generic leftism.
There is.
Yeah.
I mean, what I would say is what the meaning of proletarian socialism for me is a horizon of politics task,
Mhm.
meaning it has to do with a kind of ultimate horizon of politics from our standpoint today, which would be the dictatorship of the proletariat, meaning in a real dictatorship of the proletariat, meaning where the working class has a social and political preponderance, such that you could have liberal democratic forms, but instead of defaulting in the direction of capitalism, defaults in the direction of at least working class interests, and then those as the motivator for whatever changes need to be made in the direction of socialism. Right? So, we have a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie now in liberal democracy. And in fact, the dictatorship of the proletariat should be basically liberal democratic. It should be democratic republican, that's for sure. And it should have a lot of civil liberties that we have now and more. So, there are already inroads against the rights of private property under capitalism. That's not going to be anything new. But it will be motivated by a different interest. Meaning, right now, the inroads against private property are in the interests of capital, as opposed to being in the interests of labor and in the interests of socialism. So, it's, I think that, again, we have to demystify these terms, but also not lead with these terms. I mean, I'm talking with you. You're
Yeah.
political
Okay.
science, political theory guy. You have a certain language and understanding.
You don't call it proletarian socialist movement to the
The literal meaning
ordinary
of proletariat.
people you're trying to.
The literal meaning of proletariat in ancient,
The Roman.
Yeah, it just means the people who just produce babies. Their only
Oh, really? I
contribution.
thought it was like meant like a propertyless.
It does, but the literal meaning
Hmm.
is they just make other people. Like, in other words, they just reproduce. It means the people who do nothing for society except reproduce.
Interesting.
And that is literally the working class today. Their only contribution is to produce a surplus army of reserve labor. Right? That is their purpose. So Elon Musk is like, oh, we have a population problem. Right? He's thinking of the working class in proletarian terms. Right? So it's like everybody already knows this, right? But do we have this like ridiculous Latin word, which is not as much of a reach for the French, right? Of course, the proletariat, that term was introduced not by Marx, but by French socialism. And it wasn't as exotic a term as it is for us in English. In English, it's like proletariat. What the hell is this European insanity? Right? Or bourgeois. Like when we say bourgeois, it's like, okay, these people are just lunatic European intellectuals. We don't need any of that here. Thank you. And it goes for Great Britain too. Like Great Britain, they love to speak French when they want to, but generally they're like, yeah, that anything French, we don't really, so, I want to demystify these terms for the cognoscenti, for the intellectuals, and also just say it will be motivated when it needs to be, meaning we don't start there because right now it's unmotivated. Right now it's an abstract proposition. And I am not entirely, we've talked about this. I myself, personally, I'm open to post-Marxism. I am. But I also think post-Marxism has to be post-Marxism. It has to actually transcend Marxism. It can't be a sub-Marxism. It can't be anti-Marxism, for sure, but it also can't be sub-Marxism. It can't be just escaping from Marxism, because I think Marxism presents a real task.
While still retaining some of the dogmas.
Oh, well, that's true too. So you have sub-Marxism.
That's Corbynism, I would say.
And Stalinism.
Stalinism.
Sure. In other words, you retain Marxism in a dogmatic form, but you've got rid of all of its substance. And you really lose the plot on the point. Which is a hard one because, again, people are like, oh, no, this is abstract theory and purism. And, you have to deal with actually existing socialism. Okay. What we have to deal with is an actually existing workers' movement for socialism. And that's what we don't have. And that's what you don't have in China or Cuba or God help us, North Korea. Right. And in fact, that's the point. The point is that those states are what they are.
Well, honestly, I would say like Vietnam and China probably have more of a workers' movement, not politically, but they have the base for a workers' movement more than like
The United
Canada or
States.
the US does, in the sense that I don't
Yeah.
even think the primary contradiction is between capital and labor anymore. I mean, that's just my view. I think it's actually between those who pay rent and those who collect it. In the sense of if you look at like the divides that seem to be going on, I think the sheer concentration of capital has proletarianized even like the people who are petite bourgeoisie, in the sense that
It's in
even the
serf.
people who do own property,
It's
they
in
like have
serfdom.
exactly, like farmers now have to pay huge amounts of rents to like companies that they lease their
Intellectual
equipment
property.
from. Yeah, and that seems to be a huge basis of commonality in the way that problem with like labor itself is then it's employees versus employers, and I think that is a much tougher
Agree.
contradiction to mobilize people on, just due
It
to the fact that
is.
the petite bourgeoisie do have an antagonistic relation to like the working class
Yes.
in a way that like they don't with big capital and rentist
Capitalist
capital.
class. I mean, they do occasionally. So what I would say, because this is also in my Socialist Unity article, that I would say that we don't start with organizing labor as such. We don't. In other words, we start with working class communities and their needs in civil society, but we don't go immediately to the employer-employee antagonism or immediately to compete, which we will necessarily have to do with the established labor unions. Because I think the established labor unions are entirely capitalist in character. And therefore, we don't start there. Because it would have to be motivated, and motivated, we need a different kind of labor movement than what exists now. But how so, how that is so, is not entirely clear. It would have to become clear in practice. Right? Theoretically, we can say this or that about the existing labor movement, but ultimately it's a practical matter how they're not fit for task, even as collective bargaining fit, let alone as a basis for a struggle for socialism. But I think that all of that has to be demonstrated practically. Like, in other words, I can say that in an abstract sense. I can say that in a sentimental sense. I can say that in an intuitive psychological sense, but in a practical sense, no. It's a vague thing. And I do think that's the harder part. That kind of organizing would be harder than community organizing, right? Whether
Right.
dealing with unorganized workers or dealing with the existing organized working class. So, the kind of the left entered the labor unions and tried to sort of infiltrate the labor bureaucracy and did infiltrate the labor bureaucracy to a certain extent.
Mm.
They liquidated themselves as any kind of socialists in the process, necessarily. And also in the neoliberal era, kind of militant defensive role, in defending the existing labor unions against neoliberal onslaught. And I think that was just not the way to go. The way to go was to deal with the new situation of neoliberal capitalism and the new necessities and possibilities for
Sure.
a neoliberal capitalism. But people avoided that. They didn't do
Well,
that.
in those changes that have occurred since the neoliberal era, namely deindustrialization, globalization, is a big part of why I don't really even think socialism will necessarily be a quote unquote workers' movement,
Maybe.
in the sense that it'll probably be more what is already kind of the popular ethos of class struggle, in the way that it's manifested in a sort of nascent form, which is like, you know, I know you hate this Occupy term, but like, the people versus the elites, that sort of view. Just because, in terms of like even practical organizing, like, for example, I've tried to get people involved with a DSC, which is our, DSA of Canada. And, just talking to the people at DSC, they tell me like it's much easier to tenant organize than it is to organize labor. Like there's
Sure.
just much more opportunity for it, much more ability. People are much more eager and willing. as just due to the nature of like unions now, it's just really impossible to do solidarity strikes, right? And it's
Oh,
really hard to
right.
unionize to begin with in certain industries, right?
Right.
Because of the leverage. And I'm thinking, like, why did Marx pick the proletariat? Was just, because they had the interest and the power
And
to
also,
like
they were the
advance.
ones in motion at the time.
Right. And I mean, he was right. He was totally right about that at the time, like in terms of, at least in Europe anyway. With like our situation now, it's like I really do think, like, don't we ought to like rethink who the agents of revolutionary change are?
Well, that's premature. I think
I
that's
mean,
premature.
I think we already have rethought that. I mean, that was like the post-Marxist wave of the 90s and all that. But they just substituted working class with like the oppressed, which is sort of what the left is now. And I think that is like that's not a material category, it's an ideological category. And I
And
think
also, it
there needs to be
serves
a coalition that's based on interest in some kind, and that is
right.
across classes.
Well, so the people versus the elites, that ends up just becoming an intra-elite struggle. That's just the aspiring elite against the existing elite. That's what people versus elite amount to in reality. And that's what we've been dealing with, right? It's why the DSA has been so angsty about the PMC, because they clearly are a PMC, an aspiring elite.
Sure.
And that's it. So everything is describable in Burnhamite terms, more or less. And that's because the working class is absent. That's the point. So what you're raising, though, about like, because we've done tenant organizing in the campaign for a Socialist Party. We have done that. We've done anti-police brutality, immigrant workers' rights, and tenant organizing. Now, immigrant workers' rights is as close to producer politics as we've got. Anti-police brutality and tenant organizing is consumer politics. And that is a place that has to be organized. It is. In other words, in what way are community organizers against police brutality as taxpayers, as consumers? Right. So, as consumers of this service, police. So, there are inherent limitations to consumer politics, and yet we do have to begin there. And in some ways, producer politics, labor organizing politics, depends upon what would otherwise be seen as consumer politics. Meaning, labor organizing really depends on a social support in civil society. It can't be done simply on its own. It does require a community basis of support. So community organizing is the natural place to start, not only because it's easier, but because it actually sets a foundation for labor organizing. But again, consumer politics looks more recognizably petty bourgeois democracy. Looks like it's within that horizon, which it is, or what I called earlier liberal. Right? Meaning, we taxpayers shouldn't be abused by the police whose salaries we pay. That's entirely liberal. Right? That's consumer politics, it's liberal, and it's petty bourgeois democratic. And it would involve things like organizing the community such that the police are less necessary. And that goes on already, by the way. Meaning, gangs already do that, even though gangs have an antagonistic relationship to the police. Gangs actually police communities that the police don't want to police. And churches also do that. Churches mediate between gangs and also mediate between gangs and the state. So that's consumer level politics, and it's also civil social organizing. And so the question is, would the same thing done by socialists with a purpose of socialism in mind, however distantly, would that change the character of that? Would it change the substance of it because the means would be serving a different end? In other words, right now, the gangs and the churches are part of maintaining capitalism, however unofficially. That is the objective purpose that they serve. And of course, the socialist movement would also be doing that, but ultimately with an eye towards leveraging them. In other words, insofar as capitalism becomes dependent upon a self-organized working class at both a consumer and a producer level, then that becomes a leverage point for socialism. Right? Becomes the basis for socialism. And, the revolution then becomes basically a episodic event. So it's not, and it's more or less necessary. In other words, it's more disruptive, more violent, more necessary insofar as the working class is not well organized at the level of civil society. The less well organized the working class is, the more violent a revolution would be.
Isn't this sort of this process of moving through civil society to create the preconditions of socialist change before, any kind of revolution? Isn't this sort of like, this is Kautsky and the Social
Yeah.
Revolution, is it not?
Yeah.
Would that be a good
Absolutely.
text for people to read?
It is a good text.
Because I want to
Mhm.
when people get into this stuff, I want to try to encourage people to read the good stuff. Because what
There are
happens
3
these
good
days,
Kautsky books: Class Struggle, Social Revolution, Road to Power. And they have their limitations, they have their compromises. The Social Revolution has the least because it's really produced under the least conditions of censorship. He goes to Amsterdam. And so he can sort of speak in a more insurrectionary way. And I think he even says so, right? And whereas the class struggle, is more implied, and even the road to power is a little bit bolder, but still kind of constrained, euphemistically. But I think that they do give a sense of what the old socialist movement thought,
right?
In terms of its task. Meaning, is Kautsky describing like society and capitalism and the capitalist state? I mean, he is, but what he's really describing is the movement and its tasks.
Yeah, and also he's outlining socialism is happening through civil society, and I think it's not a coincidence why he was so interested in Christianity. He
Sure.
also wrote that big book on Christianity that I want to check. I
So-
want to redirect the conversation away from history and back to the party building.
That's
so
right.
you mentioned that this party will be from what you're describing, it seems almost like a big tent party in the sense that you're working with. Hey, you said the Ben Burgesses of the world, the Jacobin DSA, and even the MAGA communists.
Yeah, has
will have a place.
and Carlos Garrido and Eddie Liger Smith.
My
Absolutely.
immediate question with that is, why should they not just join the DSA then? Because that's kind of the DSA's approach, is to have
because the DSA is not doing this. The DSA are not building, but the DSA is not building social movement. They're not doing the civil social organizing that's necessary, and they're not going to, because it's going to get in the way of their electoral stuff.
They do
only in the service of the electoral
organizing.
Only in service of their electoral. Their heart is in the electoral. They're even organized on an electoral basis.
I do think it's definitely true that they tend to have electoral focus, but due to the variety of chapters, it's not impossible to change that. Whereas having everybody under a new party from scratch, the reason why I'm
DSA is a new party from scratch. It's not the old Harrington DSA.
The reason why I'm skeptical is because the tendency we see, right, with Marxist parties, it's the joke they say about Trotskyist parties is like, get 3 Trotskyists in a room, you have 4 different parties. That's just true of all the Marxist parties in general, because
that's why this is not that. This is not.
You see a split, but because you were saying that that these different factions should all have a say, but I'm not even convinced that party splits happen necessarily due to ideology. I think it's game theory, in the sense
there are objective conditions that refract through organizations and divide them. In other words, there's no tendency.
Yeah, well, it's especially if there's little cat fights between people in the party, it's a very easy for them to split and to have other parties. Whereas the DSA approach, it's like being a para party. I think it kind of keeps that at bay due to the fact that it's already divided from the start.
We're not a para party. We're not a party. We're pre-political. not political. So
So you want to do something more like the Socialist Party of America under Debs?
yeah. Although even that is the goal, like where we start,
Sure, of course.
right? Where we start, and where they started was quite heterogeneous, meaning they had some hardcore ideologues, they had some not so hardcore ideologues, a kind of loose social movement. I would say that, we're probably at least a decade away from forming a party. So again, forming a party would have to be motivated. You'd have to have a social movement that needs a party. So, I'm very much a student of Lenin's What is to be Done, which is to say, why is it only in 1902 that it became appropriate and necessary and not a bad move to centralize the party? Because before that, it would have been bad.
Mm-hmm.
It would have been inhibiting. It would have been counterproductive. It would have been destructive. But at a certain point, there was a need for a party. And for the movement to advance, it had to form a party.
So just for the audience, I'm going to need you to clarify there, because you said, we're 10 years away from building a party, but this is the campaign to build a socialist party. So the campaign to build a socialist party, is this process, or are you trying to start an organization that is itself a party, but it's not a party in the sense of like doing electoral stuff or, mobilizing for a revolution or whatever, but it is like a campaign to build a party?
Yes.
And
that's
come
the
up
goal.
with name and stuff and create organizational structures.
Yes. So right now, we are very loosely organized. In other words, I'm trying to bring my talents as an organizer to bear, because I do have that talent. And what I know from my organizational experience is that one should only have the amount of organization one actually needs, and one should only have the structures and rules that one needs. One should not have more structure or more rules or more organization than is actually required. Because if you do, they become counterproductive. And so they cease to be facilitating and they become inhibiting, or they become weapons of conflict. So you don't want to, when you know that there's going to be conflict, you don't want to first fashion weapons to put on a table so that they're ready at hand for people to reach for when the inevitable conflict comes. In other words, you want people to only be able to fight each other in the most primitive ways possible, because you don't want the fight to be decisive or take on a life of its own. So you don't want to provide weapons to potential conflicts before those conflicts have real meaning. And they don't have any meaning right now. All the potential conflicts now have no meaning, no substance. It's just, are you doing it or are you not doing it? Are you actually learning how to organize? Are you actually doing it? Are you developing your skills and talents? Are you becoming an organizer, or are you not? And so people who want to fight with each other, of course, are never going to learn the skills and talent of organizing. That's never going to happen. I'm very much aware.
So this is the opposite of how you kind of started doing what you were doing, because you were a part of Spartacus, right? And
it's the total opposite of that. In other words,
polemicizing other
yes.
groups, and that's the.
I mean, look, my takeaway from my experience in the Spartacus League was that they were good only insofar as they didn't do what the left usually does, which is ignore other tendencies, pretend that they don't exist. So they called attention to other tendencies by polemicizing against them. And so they kind of instructed me in terms of the vast variety of tendencies on the left and their histories. In a distorted way, though, because it was so polemical. But nonetheless, I did have a sense of Marxism was this thing, and then it splintered in all these directions. And the sense that I had was all the little pieces, all the scattered pieces contain part of the truth. And that you weren't going to polemicize your way into a reconstruction of this Marxism, that you needed to take a step back from that. And, so the Spartacists have, like other Trotskyist groups, more or less. The Cliffites, not so much. But generally speaking, the Trotskyists have a strategy. And their strategy is splitting and regrouping other tendencies. So they have a Fourth International Trotsky circa 1938 strategy that I don't think applies. I think that is, it may not have even applied in its own moment. Meaning it didn't work. Like Trotsky didn't really build the Fourth International successfully out of the crisis of the Second and Third Internationals. That didn't work. The Third International also didn't really work, meaning the Third International was built out of splits and regroupments of the crisis of the Second International, and it didn't actually attain what the Second International had, to my mind. And certainly the Fourth International did. So I don't take that kind of splitting, regrouping, and collaborating as a form of competing. That model of the Third and Fourth Internationals, no. Because I don't think it worked at the time. It certainly won't work now. We're in a different situation now. And so we're really much more in a Second International style era. And in many respects, we're in a First International era. And hopefully people are not on principle opposed to the attempted unity of social and political action, the thing that split the First International between the Marxists and the anarchists. Right? So the anarchists rejected political action and wanted to do exclusive social action. Insofar as I err on the side of social action, then it looks like anarchism. Because I think that what political action means now is not actual party building, but just capitalist electoralism. That's what it means. And the purpose of that is very unclear. So in the DSA, there's the Marxist Unity Group. And they are in the DSA because they want to do political action. They don't want to only do social action. They want to do political action. But that means running in elections. And then it becomes like, okay, well, should the DSA only endorse their own candidates and never anyone who's not under some discipline of the DSA? Good luck with that. But also, they're unclear about what the purpose of that is. They think of it as practical, whereas in the old style era of social democracy, of Second International Socialism, it was propagandistic. There were municipal governing socialists, but at a higher level of politics, it was propagandistic.
Mm-hmm.
And it was
what you mean by, electorally is how you gain influence to be known by the working class, gain legitimacy, right? Because you're not saying like just electoralism in any case is like, you're not saying no to any electoralism.
I'm not saying no, but I am saying that right now it's premature. Right now it might be counterproductive because right now I don't think we have any propaganda to offer.
Sure.
So one of my operant like ethos of the Campaign for a Socialist Party is it's taken from Brandon Johnson, who's mayor of Chicago. He said this at a platypus panel because we know him, of course. He said the problem with socialists in the Black community is socialists are heard, but they're not seen. Meaning we hear the propaganda, but we never see them in action. And what I've said is it should be the opposite. In other words, we need to be seen and not heard. Meaning we need to be seen doing, but not heard in terms of propagandizing. That's the stage that we're at now. We need to be seen and not heard, which I love the fact that it also resonates with the proper role of children, Victorian, bourgeois, middle class, right? Children are to be seen and not heard. And indeed, that's where we are. Meaning, we're not there to denounce this or that, or, again, propagandize. Because what would the propaganda be? Like, yay, socialism? No, we have to demonstrate through action. And then people know that we're the socialists. And so they're like, oh, well, the socialists are the ones who are active on every issue, who are there in the community on everything, doing. That's what socialism means. Right? We have to change the connotation, the association of the word. Socialism doesn't mean I'm going to argue that the Islamic Republic of Iran is socialist. Carlos Garrido or something, because people are like, it would be much better to just be an Islamist. Like, if you're going to make that, you know what I mean? Like, it's like, what's the
have
propaganda?
A few people in mind I can imagine, think of actually.
Right?
Like, who actually deter not just electoralism, but even, unionizing, but not for the reasons you would be critical of capitalist unions, but for the idea that unions further the process of the exploitation of the third world,
Well,
the
and
very
undoubtedly they
responses.
do. Undoubtedly they do.
So I want to get a sense of the timeline for the party building.
Uh-huh.
Do you already have an idea of how the party would be structured, names, branding, or is like we're
No.
far from that?
I think we're far from that. In other words, I think that, again, all that's premature. And the reason for that, we have models from the past, but we don't know how much those models apply to the present.
Because it's hard to imagine, right? Usually today when we think of starting a party, people just like do it, and then they might not be full on electoral forces, but they'll still be a party. Like, for example, the ACP, the MAGA communists have the ACP, and they do stuff, but it's still like a party with their branding, with their hierarchy and all that. So like what you're trying to do is not quite that. You're trying to like work up to that. But then we're like, what is the glue? That's what I'm kind of asking. Like, what
The
is the sort of
glue
yeah?
is shared. So what if we were to describe what we're doing right now, what our organization amounts to, insofar as it exists, it's basically a experience sharing group, meaning we share experiences that we have organizing across the United States and in other countries as well. Right? So basically is about trying to generate a kind of knowledge base of practical experience among activists who are all similarly motivated towards eventually starting a socialist party. And so there is, a huge gulf between what we're doing now and the ultimate goal. And we do have a certain degree of internal cohesion at the level of goal. So for me, I do think that ideologically Marxism needs to be put in the back pocket or put on the shelf or something like that. We need to sort of refrain from trying to immediately apply Marxism, either in a practical sense or in a theoretical sense. However, for instance, what we have read together within the campaign for a Socialist Party was, in fact, the three Kautsky books: The Class Struggle, The Social Revolution, and The Road to Power. And we've also done other kind of historical reading on, like, the Socialist Party of America in particular, and also the SPD. So we've read The Outlawed Party by Litka, which, again, has its own sort of perspectives and, maybe distorts the history to a certain degree, but still captures something. And then we've also engaged more the oral history of the local left, in terms of this knowledge base coming down to us from the baby boomer 60s, 70s new left generation. But we are organized in that way, right? So on the one hand, my motto: admit everything but concede nothing. So what do I mean by that? We don't want to be just an affinity group, and yet, of course, that's where we are. That's where we start. We don't want to be a ideological sect, and yet, in a certain respect, that's inevitable. Right? So, for instance, like having Kautsky as a common reading does give it that character. And so the only difference being we're aware of the pitfalls of it. We're aware of the liabilities of that. We are regretful of it, despite having inevitably to do it. In other words, we're not going to turn that into a virtue. We're not going to say, oh, yes, we have to be Kautskyan because X, Y, and Z. No. This may or may not be helpful. It's a kind of a useful way of thinking about things. But, let's not dogmatize this. Let's turn this into just a model straight up.
Sounds like the Benjamin Studebaker's definition of politics, which is like the ability to make a decision despite disagreement that you cannot bridge, right? As opposed to just getting over it. Which, I mean, if we look at the right,
they do it.
New Right Coalition,
yes,
I mean, it came about despite many differences: the evangelicals, the paleocons, the neocons,
the neocons,
the white nationalists, right? And we're not even seeing those divisions really play out until kind of recently. And
They're
maybe
also being rendered irrelevant.
Charlie Kirk maybe temporarily gave them a pseudo unity, but to see those divisions.
One of the clips of Charlie Kirk that was interesting was he was being asked by someone about LGBTQ stuff. And basically, it was like a right-wing audience member who was like, there shouldn't be any gays in our movement.
Oh, yeah, I saw this
against homosexuality. And he's like, so you want to kick out Tammy Bruce? And, he'd like rattled off the list of like gay conservatives. You want to kick them out of our movement, right? And he was saying, no, we shouldn't do that, right? So we can have some kind of principled objection to, certainly certain policies, but maybe even to homosexuality in general. But nonetheless, we wouldn't have the strength that we have now if we kicked all those people out.
Right. Which is the opposite of what the left does. The left kicked out Matt Taibbi, Glenn Greenwald, Anna Kasparian.
Kicked out Ben Burgess for appearing on Joe Rogan. They did. He
at least reacted to it kind of
There
well.
was a publisher who refused to publish a book that contained a Ben Burgess essay because he had appeared on Joe Rogan.
And those people refuse to publish you, but will publish people who want to abolish the family.
Right. Well, sure.
I know. Which you, well, maybe you would support it because you're a dirty commie. But
no. I think that, again, I agree with Marx and Engels, and also with Julia Mitchell, which is that abolition of the family is not a program because A, capitalism already does it, and B, what would it even mean? Meaning you're going to replace the family with the state? What kind of a hell is that?
That is what a lot of them kind of want.
Yeah, well, that's just some hell. I mean, the thing is, a lot of what we're dealing with now is just
that's what the early Bolsheviks tried.
They experimented
they stopped it. Yeah, they stopped it pretty fast.
They stopped it, but, there's a question about how it was tried and how it was stopped.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it was tried as an experiment. And it was stopped both in the sense of a withdrawal of support and its failure, but also then it was stopped in a more repressive way by a deliberately conservative turn in Stalinism. So, I think that a lot of the experiments of early Soviet Union were spontaneous. They just happened. They weren't like party implemented or, even instigated. So, but again, the Russian Revolution is just a strange example. It's a bizarre example that I'm not sure what kind of a model, if any, it has. All that I think that we have from the old Marxist movement is the party. And that itself is vexed. And the party in power we have the example of is like a party that lost its base. That either lost its base or didn't have its base to begin with. So that's why I'm very sympathetic to Lenin as a figure. Leninism, because Leninism, even what Lenin himself authored in terms of the early Third International or in terms of Soviet policy, I'm much less certain of, and I have grave reservations. And again, I think that we confuse tactics and principle. And we try to raise tactics to the level of principle that they're not. And also we might make a virtue of necessity that should not be. You can't make a virtue of necessity. That's just wrong.
But that is what happens because of the nature of political legitimacy, right? When Stalin has to, steal grain from the peasants to go and sell in exchange for artillery to prep for the war, he calls it socialism because that's the basis of.
Well, what he did? He called it that in a very demagogical way, but the internal understanding of that was it was the dictatorship of the proletariat. And my own sense of it is that it wasn't even that. Right? Meaning, I don't think China today would describe itself as the dictatorship of the proletariat. I would say, and also perhaps it never was.
Well, do they even say that? I think they say the whole people. They say
It's
they do the Khrushchevite thing. They say like the people, state of the whole people.
they have enshrined officially, and they do have a theoretical understanding of this, of the special role of the party. Meaning the party does include non-proletarian elements, but under proletarian hegemony within the party. Which means that it still is a dictatorship of the proletariat. Right, quote unquote, right? I'm just saying in their self-understanding.
Right, yeah.
Right? Now, of course, how cynical they are about that, whether they actually believe it themselves or not. Right? And whether, they will continue to believe in it themselves. I think that one, they will just say, you know what, actually, we're not.
Well, they almost were doing that.
They almost were doing that.
That was the trajectory until Xi.
Until Xi, and I think
no one believed China was socialist till Xi Jinping's sort of campaign and the revamping.
And I think he did that as
we're bringing back the military uniforms. And all that.
I think he did that as a stopgap measure. I know that I think that he knows that that's not a long-term thing either, and that's why he has to continue to be the leader, because he's just plugging the holes in the system. He's trying to keep it going as long as it can, but the crisis is inevitable. It's inevitable. It won't reproduce itself. It can't reproduce itself.
Yeah, that'll be
another point.
So, with organizing the party, do you have a sense of how the party would be structured in the time being? In the sense of, would it follow a vanguardist structure?
Well, no. Like I said, I think that
because what I mean is people ask that because of now Corbyn and Sultana, they try to do the your party disaster and it just fell out, and some discussion is saying, well, maybe you do need actually a stronger party with more a pyramid structure, right?
Right. I mean, what I'd say about that is that's again an electoral party, and so that has its own dynamics. It has its own pressures. And so we're not doing that. And so we will hopefully avoid those pressures and accept other pressures instead. And I think that the discipline, again, one doesn't want prematurely too much discipline. Meaning we really have to experiment right now. We're in experimental and exploratory phase. And that's why we could admit a lot of different kinds of people who are just willing to share their experience and knowledge and help others at this level without any ideological litmus test. And, being a good comrade in that respect would mean furthering the practical necessities of the kind of organizing we're trying to learn how to do. And if we found people who were only willing to help people who they ideologically were cultivating as acolytes, then we would see that as a betrayal. Right? Because again, one should be willing to share knowledge, share experience, share skills. Right now, we need to be able to do that with people that we ideologically disagree with. And again, we want that from the liberals. We want that from the liberal NGO world that we want to apprentice ourselves to, and that we are apprenticing ourselves to. Right. So here in Chicago, we've gotten training from a, basically liberal, but also with, people who think of themselves as socialists, immigrant workers center, in terms of how to organize on the ground to make communities more resistant to ICE and the deportation raids. And it's very effective. So they're a Latino group, and what we're going to do is we're going to spread that to other immigrant communities in Chicago. So the goal is to generalize this and to also take it out of the specific neighborhoods that this organization we're apprenticing under operates in Chicago, take it out of those neighborhoods and also into the suburban environment, which is very important in Chicago. A lot of workplaces are outside the city limits. So again, we're going to learn by doing, but also what we're going to be doing is trying to generalize an experience that is otherwise done under a certain kind of rubric, like a Latino community organizing, Mexican American specifically community organizing, and see how it applies outside of those specific conditions, and also become known in the broader community as the socialists who are doing it, right? But we're not doing it for media exposure. We're not doing it to, spread the word about socialism, we're doing it first and foremost to ourselves learn and then be able to teach others. And if people are interested, like, what are you guys about again? You're socialists? What does that mean? Then, they can more or less, join up. Right. But right now, in terms of socialists, in terms of anyone who thinks of themselves as a Marxist, a socialist, a communist, including anarchists, they would benefit from this. They would benefit from this kind of activity and from the kind of knowledge sharing that we can provide in the work that we're doing. Right. And, ideologically neutral, meaning if the ACP wants to train its members by participating in our organizing so as to create a better neo-Stalinist Duganite organization, God bless, go with God, all power to you, right? But in the meantime, if they join up, then they will expand the knowledge base, they will acquire experience, and they will help us, and we will gain from their participation at a practical level. And then maybe even it will loosen up their crazy ideology. Maybe they will see their own ideology in a different light when in contact with social reality. When in contact with the actual working class in reality, maybe they'll loosen up some of this stuff. Maybe they'll slowly lose the charm of this Duganism and whatnot. And that goes for all the ideological tendencies. In other words, I think the luster will wear off these ideologies pretty quickly anyway, but certainly more so because reality is more compelling. Real people are more compelling than crackpot ideas, I think.
Do you think that part of why Marxists so rarely do this kind of thing in practice is because if they did
it
do
would be
this,
a threat.
they would lose their Marxism?
It would. That's right. It would be a threat to them ideologically. But that's exactly why it has to be done. Because this ideology is worthless. This leftist ideology is absolutely worthless.
I do agree, but that begs a question. What drives people to do this sort of thing? Because, of course, the classical Marxist conception was it was collective interests economically that would drive people. But if power doesn't drive people, which tends to be what really drives people most of the time to engage in political action, what is driving people to do this sort of thing? Because I think there's always some reason, some kind of purpose.
People are ideologically driven. I mean, I'm enough of an old-fashioned Marxist to think that a lot of what people think of as their Marxism is actually something else, and Marxism is just a sort of thin rationalization for it. Meaning, again, I do think that they are really petty bourgeois radicals. They're motivated by petty bourgeois democratic discontent. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily aspiring elites. They could be extremely self-sacrificing, serve the people types. But I think that Marxism provides a kind of thin rationalization, and that's why it's a very selective Marxism usually among activists, including activist organizations. And, they basically agree to speak a certain language, and that's what ideological agreement amounts to. But in substance, maybe there isn't all that much agreement because they all just do liberal activism anyway. And that doesn't.
I think a lot of the time it's religion without the Father.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Religion without God.
Right. That's really what I mean.
Right. And it is that, and it serves that purpose. And so I think that we just have to be realistic about, what purpose does Marxism serve nowadays? It serves nowadays as an overwrought rationalization for essentially liberal politics.
Or something worse.
Well, it can be reactionary, it can be fascistic, it can be. But I think that, what we've seen.
I think Stalinism, I think even like third world Maoism, a lot of the stuff that you saw in the 70s is kind of weather underground stuff. I mean, all of that I think is actually like much worse, and you see echoes of it. You see echoes of it today. I mean, I would say
echoes of it today.
Right, I would call it just the broader like anti-civilizational streak that you see in the kind of left that like is predicated not on like building but on the collapse.
The older Maoists weren't like that. In other words, I've known older Maoists and they annoyed me in certain ways, but they weren't nihilists. They weren't.
Sure, and Mao certainly wasn't.
Mao certainly wasn't.
But I mean, like, the sort of thing that you see, which is like the project of like radical leftism is to either delegitimize the current order so that it's easier to topple, with, of course, the assumption that they would be the one to seize the
Benefit,
vacuum, and
right?
not far right.
Not
Right.
fascists. Yeah.
Yeah. But or this idea that, accelerate the contradictions so that it collapses, and then, as opposed to like building in the here and now. I think um when we say like rationalization for liberal politics, I don't even know if, like, I think maybe you could
Not
say like
even
that's
that
for
good.
the reformists. No, I think that's too charitable, honestly. I think a lot of leftism is nihilism today. Like, Stephen
Too
Harper, the
much
Prime
of it
Minister of
is.
Canada, said this, and I
Mhm.
hate this guy. Stephen Harper is how I got into politics, because I hate Stephen Harper.
Right.
That's what prompted like a lot of people to move leftward in Canada. He was former leader of the Conservative Party, and he was interviewed by this like right-wing kind of Dave Rubin talk show, and they were saying the
Mhm.
cultural neo-Marxists, don't you think they pose an existential threat to whatever? They're spreading this neo-Marxism, wokeism. And he said, these people aren't Marxists. They're not even socialists. They're nihilists. They don't believe in anything. They just want to burn things down because they don't like what they see.
True enough.
And I couldn't help but thinking like,
He gets it.
which is
Yep.
something I am worried about when it comes to revolutionary politics and being selective about
Oh,
what I promote and what I don't. Part of why I
my
had you
old
on,
professor Moish Pastone.
right? Part of why I bring you on is because, one, your historical narrative leads to one that is not like
I
I
was
want to destroy America, right?
right.
And the other thing is like building something. It's kind of why with the ACP people, I think I don't hate the ACP in the way some people do. Like, I think the way they want to like make American socialism is frankly retarded in terms of like the weird concoction of Duginism and Eastern despotism with Marxism. It's just this weird kind of thing. But like,
Genghis
at least we're
Khan.
trying to build something. They're not trying to just
Right.
only like tear stuff down.
But they're trying not to be nihilists. They are, and that's commendable. I mean,
Mhm.
the way that I'd put it is, so that's the left at its worst. The left at its best is they just become progressive liberal Democrats. Meaning, I just have in mind like Van Jones. Van Jones, who was an advisor of Barack Obama, he was a Maoist. He was a kind of black nationalistic Maoist. And so what that trained him to be was a perspicacious, intelligent, centrist Democrat. In other words, like ideologically, he was a black nationalist Maoist. In reality, he was just the rejuvenation of a centrist Democratic Party progressive liberalism. And that's cool too. And so as many people will do that out of their radical leftism as will become nihilistic. I mean, many more people will do that than will become like terrorists. I think many more people will just become standard progressive liberal capitalist politicians or academics, or community organizers. Some of them will just become community organizers, and sentimentally they'll be anarchist or Maoist or Trotskyist or this or that. But in reality, they will just be liberals. And what I'm saying is we're honest with ourselves about that up front. Right? Okay, if that's what we really are, then we need to admit that to ourselves to begin with. And rather than that leading us to a cynical acquiescence and adaptation to capitalist politics, that we need to see our task as pushing the limits of that we have a duty beyond that. And again, one of my pet peeves is I'm very much against this fight the right kind of leftism, because I think that that does is that it allows one to abdicate the task. It allows one to say not only is Marxism on the shelf, but also socialism put on the shelf, because in the immediacy we have to fight the right. And it's like, that's not going to happen. In other words, that's not going to work. And in the meantime, we'll be blinding ourselves to the new form of capitalism that we actually have to operate in. trying to be the last defenders of the old form of capitalism. And that's what I've seen. That's the dynamic that I've seen. So I think the DSA left will become the last defenders of neoliberalism. And they'll be angsty about it. They'll be against identity politics, but they'll inevitably do it because the alternative is Trumpism. And you don't want to be a Trumpist. And you don't want to be a Gavin Newsom accommodating Trumpism, agreeing with Charlie Kirk, right, on trans going too far, right? You don't want to do that. So what are you going to be? You're going to be the last defenders of the most absurd version of neoliberalism, and that's going to be your leftism.
Well, that's why whenever people say like woke was a liberal thing and not a leftist thing, and I only hear this from leftists who want to pick and choose like the left parts of the left they like.
Yep.
Yep. I mean, the biggest proof that that's not true is that the liberals have abandoned wokeism at this point.
Sure.
Like they've been abandoning it. It's really been the left who still says like, wokeism doesn't exist.
On to it. That's right. Wokeism doesn't exist, which means they're going to be the last defenders of it. No, it's quite crazy. And again, I mean, the lines of demarcation are such that it's like, okay, whether you're pro or anti-woke, like whatever, like that's not a good way of adjudicating things. But, I'm interested in BLM. Yeah, post-woke. Like, I'm interested in BLM insofar as they've gathered any organizing experience whatsoever. I don't think that they have, but in the degree to which they have, I'm interested in working with them. I'm interested in learning from them. I think that they were pretty much cut short. I think that there's a lot of post-political sentiment there that's counterproductive, like leaderless movements without demands, protests without demands, movements without leaders, this kind of thing, which is just an evasion. It's not really true. It's bullshit. And like nobody represents BLM or whatever, or the people who do are, of course, the corrupt sellouts.
Right. And I think it mistakes human governance with political governance, which is like, because the anarchists, I think, just have like a very wrong view of what went wrong in the Soviet Union. Like they have this idea that you can't have vanguardism, you can't have like a party structure. Because it's like, I like to say in response to the vanguardism, I mean, most, at least in parliamentary systems, all political parties are in a sense vanguardist in that they have a pyramid structure where like power is more delegated the more higher up you go, and there is a barrier to entry.
Even democratic centralism, the capitalist parties practice it, especially in parliamentary systems.
Yeah, America less so,
America,
which is why I think there's...
That's because you can't have coalitions in the United States. So there are things in the United States that work against the parties being organized in that way. But in the actual parliamentary governing, because we don't have parliamentary government in the United States. We have a presidential system. But in parliamentary government, you need democratic centralism. You know what they have in the United States? They have cabinet discipline. They do. So that's one.
Yes.
That's one thing that they have that's the same as the parliamentary system.
Certainly now.
Right.
Maybe not before.
Right.
As much.
But generally.
Yeah.
And also for legal reasons. Like there are kind of liability issues to, presenting it in front at the executive level. Because otherwise it is harder to adjudicate who's actually legally responsible for policies.
Well, that's kind of why I think, like, in America, if one is going to take the electoral route, you're much better off running in both parties and choosing based on candidates in the area rather than this, like, current DSA strategy, which is bent on running Democrats. It's like there's gerrymandered districts. Of course, you're going to have to, like, in certain, there's some people in my Discord who are telling me, that they're trying to pitch this idea to their local DSA chapter in Texas because in their particular area, it's just impossible to ever even run a Democrat through the district. So actually, like, running a red Republican is not impossible.
That's right.
I mean, but with regard to like this Vanguard thing, I brought that up particularly because I think those who reject the idea of like organization, top-down organization. They think that that is like the microcosm of what will be like a totalitarian government. And I think what that totally
Parties
misses
are
is,
not states.
yeah, and exactly like, well, the democracy, right? Like representative democracy is not supposed to be the people directly ruling. It's
Right.
the alternation of
That's right.
parties. Like
Representative parties. That's right. So
yeah,
parties are not states. What goes for party organizing doesn't go for state organization. And of course, I consider the fusion, and this is where I'm a Leninist not in the ist sense, but rather follower of Lenin. Lenin neither intended nor did he approve of the fusion of the party and the state. Right. And so the party was meant to be a civil social organization, as they are. They are that. And, at most parastatal, but insofar as the party becomes too fused with the state, that's a problem. Politically, it's a problem. It's a liability. It creates a much more fragile political system in the capitalist world. But also, in terms of the struggle for socialism, the non-identity of class, party, and state. That's very important.
very important, because the opposite of that is literally the definition of totalitarianism.
Totalitarianism, and I always like to point out the problem with totalitarianism is not that it is so effective, but rather because it doesn't really work, and so all you get is complete corruption and irresponsibility.
Right. And disguised disagreements that all you get is the alternation of powers through secret coups, backstabs, and disagreements that are rationalized in Marxist language. I mean, I try to really depict that in my latest video, just because there's so many people today who still really believe like, okay, well,
If
I mean,
only
a lot
we
of
had a
Trotskyists,
totalitarian system, that would be good.
or if
because
only we had
it's-
the right
yeah,
leaders, if only they did the right
Yeah,
things. And the
it's like-
rationale of like Marxism, Leninism is they say, well, we should learn from our mistakes and like maybe like be less harsh, let's have less repression this time. It's like, who's we? Even during
Yeah,
this
who's
time,
the
there was
we?
no we.
Who's
It's
the
like
we?
if you want to become an elite, right?
Yep.
You're going to join the party and then use the language and adapt, and that's where you get this confusion. I think that's kind of where elite theory does influence me, in the sense that I think there's a kind of realism in which there is going to be like the power hungry people, and you kind of want to give an outlet for them, but make sure
course.
none of them have too much power.
Yes, absolutely. I completely agree with that. We need to channel it, but we also need to discipline it and control it. Right. So this is why, I think that there's a lot here, meaning there's a lot of confusion, especially at this level. There's a confusion about civil liberties, civil society. There's, separation of powers in the state, which I think is probably a good idea. But insofar as socialists ever argued against it, it was still based on the idea if you were to centralize powers in the state, it would still be based, it was for the dictatorship of the proletariat. It was temporary, transitory, and would not really be the dictatorship of the proletariat unless there was a preponderant social power outside the state. So that was actually the essential division of power, was between the state and society. And again, whether they were right or wrong about that, they were not for the statification of society.
Mm-hmm.
They were not, like, clearly. And, in their practice, also the way the parties were organized. Now, I'm very much aware of like the Robert Mickles critique of the SPD and oligarchy and all this stuff. I'm very much aware of that, but I'm also aware of the fact that they really did have a working class base. And for better or for worse, the working class base limited what the party could and could not do.
Sure.
For better
Absolutely.
or for worse.
Yeah.
And so I think that, and again, to be aware of the fact that in capitalism, there is a self-contradiction of democracy. I think I've mentioned this book to you before, Dick Howard, Spectres of Democracy. He's an interesting one. And, because he goes back into Marx and reads Marx very closely on the Democratic Republic. So I think that the issue there is we've accepted state socialism both through social democracy and Stalinism. And the only alternative to that has been anarchism. And I think that something essential has been lost between those two.
I was just writing down that book.
Yeah, it's good.
Victors of democracy.
It's good. And because, he's influenced by some French theory, Claude Lefort and Frankfurt School, but ultimately is really just sort of diving into Marx and, trying to reconstruct, what is this relationship between democracy and communism in the original conception. And also, along the way, he gets into the French versus the American Revolution. In other words, democratic republicanism versus republican democracy. This sort of division within the democratic republican ideal. And he's an old new leftist, so it's fruitful, it's useful, it's productive, just in terms of trying to parse out theoretical and political philosophical categories.
So, how can people who want to get involved in this project, this campaign to build a socialist party, get involved? And what would be some like practical things they could do?
Okay, so I would say, so there's campaign for a socialist party, US, gmail.com. That's one way of getting in touch with us. And I can send you, and maybe you can include it in the description of the video. And then we have an onboarding process. And again, putting people in touch with other organizers regionally, but also we're able to do a lot coordinating with people remotely in terms of offering advice and guidance. And, but really what's required is for people to get involved in civil social activity locally where they are. And so it probably makes sense for people to join as groups or teams, or at least dynamic duos, to help out, because it's hard to do things entirely on one's own. One has to be especially talented to be able to navigate these things entirely on one's own. So, we're realistic about this. And also people can help in a variety of ways. So some people can help in a more distant way in terms of the kind of back end kind of stuff, the more administrative things, those kinds of tasks. So people can contribute that way. But we are really trying to, and of course, I mentioned journalism. So one thing that we were also encouraging people to do is to do journalism activism. In other words, to report on their activity and to have their participation in activism also take the form of journalistic reporting on reportage, that kind of writing. And also we're developing techniques for basically anonymizing that kind of reportage, so as to protect not only our own identities, but also the identities of people who are doing the kind of grassroots organizing on the ground that is going on. So without sort of, allowing for things to be exposed in a deleterious way, can we nonetheless give people a sense of what's possible, what can be done, to report on things that are not meant to be mediatized or broadcast, or not meant to be, they're not done in order to enhance people's public profiles, but are really done in a kind of quasi-underground or in a private way. But nonetheless, right, how can we produce, again, a knowledge base for that kind of activity? Because that's really where we're at. And so there are different ways of contributing to that. There are different ways of participating in that. And we do have a variety of things. Like I said, we've been active on a variety of issues. We've been operating on a variety of fronts in gaining this kind of experience. Because that's really what it's about. I mentioned that it's experimental, it's exploratory. That means that we're in an experience gaining phase of our activity as the campaign for a socialist party. So if that appeals to people, meaning, try something new, open-mindedly, experimentally, exploratorily, and, we're there to counsel people through that, to counsel the kind of patience that's required to develop oneself into an organizer. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to train organizers. It's cadre building, again, admit everything, concede nothing, and, do what the left is doing or claims to be doing, but more self-consciously, in a more self-aware way, less fooling ourselves than the left typically does, and more patiently, more realistically, understanding the long timetables, time scale involved, and supporting each other, supporting ourselves through that process. Right. These are the tasks that we have.
And maybe it's the friends you made along the way, as they say.
It might be. It might be. I mean, of course, it's that. I will also say that, though, which is that in the context of post-pandemic reality and also generational reality, the left has been a subculture for a long time. It's been a social circle for a long time, but it needs to be more than that. And it can't primarily be that. And it can't be that, but under some weird pretense of not being that either. So, of course, we're forgiving of that, even inviting of it to a certain extent. But we're not primarily there to make friends. We're there to make comrades,
Mm.
to make collaborators, colleagues. Right. Because again, we have to be able to work together, learn from each other, support each other without liking each other. So, like, I've had to be able to get along with people who either didn't like or disapproved of me, my whole life. And I was a crazy leftist, and I was a nerd, and I was a kind of eccentric kid, and so I've had to learn to be able to get along with people in situations and fit in well. I don't know. These are like basic life skills, and obviously leftists have to be able to do that. Otherwise we're never going to get anywhere.
Well, I think part of why it's hard to do that is because a lot of the people who are leftists are the antisocial types.
Yes.
It's part of why they get recruited.
Yes.
Just look at like the Instagram ads of a lot of communist parties. You'll kind of see a very clear pattern that it's kind of the outcasts who tend to join the groups. And, I have nothing against the outcasts,
Right.
but it's the problem is sometimes if you lack the social skill to like talk to people outside, it's a little hard. And you do see that.
Yeah, you do see that, unfortunately. And again, we have to help people rise above themselves. We have to allow people to give themselves to a higher purpose, really. And again, that higher purpose is socialism. And maybe along the way, people can acquire social skills that they initially lack. I mean, certainly that would be a goal. And again, I think that has to be motivated. It's not like, acquire social skills for the sake of acquiring social skills. It's rather, it's much more likely to happen if there's a reason to do so.
Right. The first step to socialism is to socialize.
Yeah. Right. Now, I used to joke back in the day, socialists are not necessarily socialites, but it wouldn't hurt.
Right. We hate the socialites.
Yeah, well, socialites have a class coding, but you know what I mean,
Uh-huh.
right? It's a play on the idea of socialism and socialize. And socialites, we can't be the mean girls, no. We can't be the mean girls. Although, again, it's like the victims of the mean girls might themselves turn things around and become the mean girls. We have to resist that.
Yes, indeed. Dismissal culture, as my mentor Assad Haider wrote in a few articles. His article called On Dismissal, and talks about this sort of thing, and talks about the Cultural Revolution. It's what prompted me to cover the Cultural Revolution. Anyhow, thank you for your time, Chris.
Thanks a lot, Tim.
People are interested, you can check the description. There'll be a link there and some information. If you enjoyed this podcast so far, the second half of the conversation is available on Patreon, part of the Backroom exclusive podcast for patrons only. If you're not a patron already and you want to be, I highly recommend it. It's very cheap. It's less than the cost of a coffee. And for the entire month, you get access to an entire archive of exclusive podcasts that I've done. Some of the most interesting conversations I've had have been in the Backroom exclusive podcasts. At this point, you get access to well over 75, I think, exclusive podcasts by becoming a patron. It's well worth it. You can ask patrons in the Discord or patrons in the comments section. They'll tell you it's very much worth it. And it's also a way to support this show and what I do in the main channel. In fact, it's the main means by which this entire One Dime project makes any money. And frankly, I think compared to what you get in return for becoming a patron of a lot of other YouTube channels, it's a lot more worth it to become a patron of this one. And yeah, you'll get access to the second half of this conversation. So see you in the back room and see you in the Discord.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimist, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.